Scotland may not have won the World Cup, but if you love football, you owe this country more than you think. Passion, rivalries, unforgettable players. Scottish football has shaped the game in ways that reach far beyond its borders. From the world's first international match to legendary European triumphs. Celtic, Rangers, Scottish football history is full of drama. So let's go back to where it all began, the rise of football in Scotland. Football in this country was a chaotic, lawless game, and it wasn't even called football. Mentions of Scots playing a form of sport date back to the 15th century, although the rules were, well, let's just say there weren't many of them. Football was more of a free-for-all game, often played between entire villages, with the pitch stretching for miles and the game ending when one side gave up, or in some cases, when the players were too injured to continue. It was so wild and unruly that the then King of Scotland, King James I, actually banned it in 1424, fearing it would distract his soldiers from doing their everyday duties. But would you be able to stop a passionate fan from watching his favourite football team? Well, in the same way, football was just meant to continue. It wasn't a sport you could just ban out of existence. By the 19th century, the game had developed into something more recognisable, particularly in Scotland's biggest cities. The real turning point came in 1867, with the founding of Queen's Park FC in Glasgow, Scotland's first and oldest football club. Unlike the disorderly versions that had gone before, Queen's Park embraced structure, introducing passing and tactics rather than just physical force. Their Latin motto, ludere causa ludendi, to play for the sake of playing, captured the spirit of what football was becoming. Queen's Park were pioneers, not just in Scotland, but across the world. They developed the short passing style that would become the foundation of the modern game, at a time when English teams still relied on kicking the ball as far forward as possible and hoping for a miracle to score a goal. In fact, Scotland's influence on the game was growing so fast that in 1872, something historic happened. The world's first official international football match. It took place on the 30th of November 1872 at the West of Scotland cricket ground in Glasgow, and the opponents, who else but England. There had been unofficial meetings between Scottish and English players before, but this was the first official international. Unlike today, there was no global spotlight, no multi-million-pound contracts at stake, no TV rights, just 4,000 curious spectators, each paying a shilling to watch history unfold. Scotland, represented entirely by players from Queen's Park, took to the field in dark blue, a tradition that continues even to this day. Their opponents, on the other hand, arrived with a more direct, physical approach to the game, embodying the kick and rush style that had dominated English football for decades. The Scots, however, had something different: tactics. They passed the ball, they moved as a unit, they worked together rather than relying on individual brilliance. And although the game ended in a 0-0 draw, it was a statement. Scotland had not only held their own, they had shown the world a new way of playing football. Over the next few decades, Scotland's influence on the game spread across Britain and beyond. English clubs began to adopt the short passing game, and Scottish players, known as Scotch professors, were in demand across England, helping to shape the likes of Aston Villa, Sunderland, and even Manchester United. By the end of the 19th century, football was booming in Scotland. Clubs were forming all over the country, and thousands of fans were turning up to watch their teams. But there was a problem. There was no organised league. Clubs played matches, but they were mostly friendly matches or cup competitions. There was no official structure, no clear way to determine which team was the best in the country. That all changed in 1890, when the Scottish Football League, SFL, was born. The league was conceived by William McGregor, a Scot who had played a key role in the formation of the English Football League 2 years earlier. He saw the potential for a structured competition in Scotland as well, and helped bring the clubs together to make it happen. The inaugural season of the Scottish Football League featured 11 teams, including Celtic, Heart of Midlothian, Dumbarton and Rangers, the latter two of whom were declared joint champions on 29 points. And even though the Scottish League back then had nothing in common with what the game is today, in terms of sponsorship, pitches and global recognition, it gave the team something they had never had before: consistency. They were actually competing for something, not just under the banner of Ludere Causa Ludendi. One of the biggest storylines of those early years was the dominance of Queen's Park, or rather their discipline. The club that pioneered Scottish football refused to turn professional for the first 152 years of their existence, sticking to their amateur values, while other teams embraced the financial side of the game. Yeah, they eventually turned professional as late as 2019, but the decision to remain amateurs cost them their strong initial reputation. In the early years, they were the biggest and most successful team in Scotland, but over time, Celtic and Rangers began to rise to the top, ushering in a new era in Scottish football. And of course, that rise eventually created one of the fiercest rivalries in the world, the Old Firm. Yes, history tells us that their first meeting was in 1888, when Celtic won the first Old Firm derby 5-2 in a friendly. But their rivalry took on a very different form in the early 20th century. It's fair to say that for the first 20 years or so, the Old Firm was never just about football. It was cultural, social and deeply personal. By the 1920s, the Old Firm was the defining force in Scottish football, and its meetings were far more than just matches. They were battles for pride, identity and supremacy, attracting tens of thousands of fans and cementing their place as one of the most intense rivalries in world football, something that still holds true in the 2020s. While the likes of Hearts, Hibernian and Aberdeen had their moments, it was clear that Scottish football belonged to the Old Firm, and their grip on the game was only getting stronger. So it's no surprise that these two teams have always been the backbone of the national team. Speaking of Scotland, one of the highlights of their early history was the Wembley Wizards of 1928. In April that year, Scotland faced England at Wembley in the British Home Championship. The English media were overconfident, but they hadn't factored in Alex Jackson, Alex James and the rest of the Scottish team. The Scots tore England apart, running out 5-1 winners in what remains one of their greatest victories. Interestingly, apart from the Wembley Wizards, the Scots who took part in that match are also remembered as the Mighty Midgets, with a forward line featuring no player taller than 5'8". In the decades that followed, Scotland continued to produce elite talent, with legends such as Denis Law, Billy Bremner and Kenny Dalglish emerging in the 1960s and 70s. The national team even enjoyed another iconic moment in 1977, when they beat England 2-1 at Wembley. But for all the individual brilliance, World Cup success remains elusive. And if you're wondering, why would you put Scotland and the World Cup in the same sentence? Well, if you are one of the world's first footballing nations, it makes sense that you would have won some international accolades, or at least gone deep into a competition. Yeah, they regularly qualified for international tournaments, but always fell short, with the 1978 campaign in Argentina infamous for the high expectations that ended in disaster. On the other hand, however, the case of club football was on a completely different level in terms of global recognition compared to the national team. And of course, the peak of that was 1967, when Celtic achieved the unthinkable. Jock Stein's Celtic side, known as the Lisbon Lions, became the first British club to win the European Cup, beating Inter Milan 2-1 in the final. What made it even more incredible, every single player in that team was born within 30 miles of Celtic Park. A true homegrown success story. By the way, if you want to know more about the Lisbon Lions, you can check out our dedicated video on that topic. Rangers also had their fair share of triumphs, winning the 1972 Cup Winners' Cup with a 3-2 win over Dynamo Moscow. Then, in 1983, Scotland's third biggest club, Aberdeen, led by the legendary Sir Alex Ferguson, stunned Real Madrid 2-1 in the same competition, proving that Scottish football wasn't just about the Old Firm. After a strong couple of decades between the 60s and 80s, the golden days for Scottish football on the European stage were fading. Money was pouring into European football, and clubs from Italy, Spain and England were on the rise, with Scottish clubs struggling to keep up. Yeah, there were some bright moments, such as Rangers' unbeaten run through the group stages of the 1992-93 Champions League, but they still couldn't qualify for the final against AC Milan. Celtic, meanwhile, went through their toughest financial period in the early 1990s, and were even on the brink of bankruptcy before Ferguson McCann came to the rescue by acquiring a 51% majority stake in the club. Arch rivals Rangers, however, also failed to escape the heavy chains of financial hardship. In 2012, the Gers, as they are also known, entered administration due to significant tax liabilities and financial mismanagement. Unable to reach a company voluntary arrangement with creditors, the club faced liquidation. Consequently, Rangers were demoted to the fourth tier of Scottish football and had to rebuild from there. This period of financial turmoil allowed Celtic to dominate Scottish football for the next decade, securing multiple league titles in Rangers' absence. Although Rangers have since returned to the Scottish Premiership, they continue to face financial challenges, struggling to consistently compete with Celtic's dominance. Which brings us to the modern era of Scottish football, which is a mixture of struggle and revival. Yeah, the old firm still respects the fans for their passion and heritage, but it is clear to all that Scottish football is unlikely to be able to compete with Europe's biggest nations anytime soon. However, there is still a lot of hope, and we are currently seeing a very strong Scottish generation of top footballers, including Andrew Robertson, John McGinn, Kieran Tierney and Scott McTominay, who have been the cornerstones of the national team for the last 5 to 10 years. And the team's results have certainly reflected this, with Scotland qualifying for their first major international tournament of the 21st century, Euro 2020, after 22 years of absence, with the last major tournament being the 1998 World Cup. With that being said, we've come to the end of today's video. Tell us what you think. What surprises you the most about Scottish football history? And do you see a club from the league repeating Celtic's 1967 glory anytime soon? Also, if you enjoyed this one, hit the like and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. And check out our latest upload on the 7 legends who peaked after the age of 30. And I'll catch ya in the next one.